They thought they were safe, they thought the walls around them would never crack, that the shocking truth is now spilling out and the world is asking the one question no one ever thought possible. Did Blake Lively hold them hostage? Justin Baldoni has just unleashed new evidence that paints a chilling picture, one that flips the entire Hollywood drama upside down, and you are not ready for the moment they realize they were trapped, because it changes everything. Welcome back to Starscope, the place where Hollywood's deepest secrets meet the spotlight, where the stories others avoid come alive. And today, we are diving into something that will shake every viewer to their core, because what Justin Baldoni's team has just revealed is not only explosive, it is unlike anything we have ever seen in this long-running saga with Blake Lively. Because behind the polished smiles, the staged red carpets, and the carefully written press releases, something darker was happening, and it was happening in silence. Evidence has now surfaced that suggests Blake Lively held more control over her opponents than anyone could have guessed, creating an environment so restrictive, so calculated, that people close to the case are calling it hostage-like behavior. And that word alone, hostage, changes the temperature of the room instantly. It takes this from a messy Hollywood spat into something deeply unsettling, and what makes this even more powerful is that it did not come from speculation. It came from newly uncovered communications messages that reveal a level of manipulation and pressure that Justin Baldoni's legal team is now framing as a deliberate attempt to trap, silence, and destroy opposition. When you hear hostage, you think of doors, locked, chains, rattling, a scene out of a movie, but in Hollywood the hostage taking is different. It is not about rooms with no exit. It is about reputations with no escape. It is about the chilling silence forced upon people who dared to speak up or push back, and this is exactly what Baldoni's side is exposing. They're saying that Blake and her inner circle orchestrated a set of conditions where rivals had no way out and no voice to fight back. What's so terrifying is that the evidence doesn't just describe the mechanics of this entrapment, it shows the exact moment when the people on the receiving end realized they were being held in a vice, and that realization is haunting. Imagine being in a room thinking you have control, thinking you have leverage, and then slowly it dawns on you that every door has already been locked from the outside. Baldoni's lawyers are building their narrative on this moment. They are pointing to communications that show key figures were slowly boxed and cut off from allies, denied access to information, and told in no uncertain terms that if they stepped out of line, there would be devastating consequences. This is the hostage moment, not chains, not ropes, but a suffocating, invisible prison where your career, your image, your future are tied up in knots, and every knot leads back to Blake Lively and Reynolds. Now, what makes this revelation so dangerous for Blake is that courts look not only at physical harm, but at coercion, intimidation, and undue influence. And when those words start appearing in filings, they echo like thunder. The claim is that Blake's team weaponized access, weaponized resources, and weaponized fear to corner their targets. The bombshell is that they didn't just corner them, they kept them there, and the moment of realization is now being described in detail in witness statements. One insider reportedly wrote that it was like waking up in a cage you didn't even realize you had been locked inside. The slow drip of control, the constant monitoring, the subtle threats, until one day you notice there is no way out. And this chilling metaphor is exactly what Baldoni's side is presenting to the judge. Now think about the ripple effects here. Hollywood thrives on image, power, and networking, but if Baldoni's claims stick, if this hostage narrative takes root, it will destroy not only Blake's public perception, but also the credibility of the industry figures who enabled her, because no one wants to be associated with a storyline this dark and manipulative already. Whispers in Hollywood corridors suggest that some stars are quietly distancing themselves, fearing the fallout, because they know the hostage narrative is not something fans or media forgive easily. It is sticky, it is haunting, it is unforgettable, and most of all, it is believable when backed up by raw evidence. What makes this even more gripping for viewers is how close it all came to being buried. Because according to sources, this evidence was almost lost, hidden in sealed communications, and buried under confidentiality agreements, but Baldoni's persistence has ripped the lid off, and now it is spilling out piece by piece, and with every new detail, the walls around Blake seem to close in tighter and tighter. The unraveling of this case is nothing short of cinematic, and Starscope brings you right into the storm, because when Justin Baldoni and his team revealed the newly surfaced evidence, it was not just paper and ink, it was an emotional timeline. A chilling sequence of events that painted Blake Lively in a way audiences had never seen before. The documents were meticulous, almost surgical in their detail, showing how one by one doors were closed off around Baldoni, how conversations were intercepted, how narratives were rewritten, and how opportunities were suddenly stripped from his reach. It was not the kind of open competition Hollywood pretends to celebrate. It was a strategy layered with precision, a plan that left Baldoni cornered, as though he were being held metaphorically hostage, unable to move freely within the industry. And the shocking part was not only that it happened, but that those closest to the power centers knew exactly when the grip tightened. Baldoni's lawyers walked the courtroom through emails, texts, and communications that made the pattern impossible to ignore. The timing was precise, the control was clear every time Baldoni pushed back, a new barrier appeared, and every time he saw allies, those allies suddenly pulled away as if strings are being pulled from somewhere higher. The new evidence did not simply suggest coincidence. It laid out a framework that could only be explained by intent, and as the judge listened, it became clear this was no longer about speculation, it was about proof, and that proof was damning for Blake Lively's carefully curated image. The word hostage echoed in the filings, not in the literal sense but in the professional sense, where a man's career was locked behind invisible chains, held in place by fear, influence, and the threat of further destruction. Insiders whispered about meetings where Baldoni's name was not allowed to be mentioned, about projects where his participation was discussed only in hushed tones, and about networks that seemed inexplicably unwilling to take risks. With him, it was as though his reputation had been quarantined, and the question everyone now asked was who had the power and the motive to orchestrate such a lockdown. Baldoni's lawyers argued that the only consistent name across these maneuvers was Blake Lively. Her reach, her connections, her presence at critical decision points became undeniable, and while she has always projected herself as the golden figure of Hollywood, the evidence threatened to tarnish that image forever. The courtroom itself felt charged, as if every revelation added another layer of electricity. Reporters scribbled furiously as one piece of correspondence after another was entered into the record, detailing how events aligned so perfectly against Baldoni that randomness can no longer be a defense. What shocked many was not just the coordination, but the coldness of it, the way certain opportunities were dangled in front of him before being pulled away at the last second, leaving him disoriented, discredited, and increasingly isolated. Hollywood veterans who watched from the sidelines whispered that this was the kind of power play rarely exposed publicly, the kind of maneuvering that everyone knows exists but few ever dare to challenge. And now Baldoni was not only challenging it, he was putting it under the harsh lights of the courtroom stage for the world to see, and that is what made this moment so massive. Because if his team was right, and if the court accepted that these invisible chains were deliberately placed, then the entire narrative around Blake Lively shifts. She is no longer simply the actress with the glamorous brand, she becomes the central figure in one of the most shocking behind-the-scenes dramas Hollywood has ever faced. The hostage metaphor sticks because it perfectly encapsulates the suffocating environment Baldoni described. He was trapped not by physical force but by influence and reputation, manipulated to a point where he could not act without consequence. And that is where the case takes on a life larger than itself, because if it could happen to him, it could happen to others, and that makes this story not just about two stars but about the dangerous undercurrent of control within Hollywood itself. And as Starscope continues to unpack these details, the question becomes, will the truth set Baldoni free, or will the invisible chains prove stronger than even the law can break? The unraveling tension reached a point where no one could deny that something deeply disturbing had occurred behind the polished facade of Hollywood glamour. Justin Baldoni's camp had unearthed footage, emails, and private testimonies that began painting a picture far darker than anyone had dared whisper. The word hostage was now no longer some sensationalized tabloid grabber. It was tied to context, it was tied to evidence, and suddenly the air of control, the laughter, the curated public image surrounding Blake Lively seemed to twist into something suffocating. Insiders described how during critical moments, when negotiations were tense, when meetings turned into confrontations, and when creatives sought to walk away from a project or speak openly about mistreatment, they found themselves cornered, not physically in chains, but trapped by legal threats, reputational sneers, and the implied destruction of their careers. And the documents Baldoni's team revealed suggested that Blake leveraged relationships and legal pressure in such a way that even seasoned professionals described it as psychological hostage taking. One producer admitted that at first they thought it was paranoia until they too experienced the sudden flood of cease and desist letters phone calls from lawyers, and threats to their professional standing after one disagreement. Another former associate explained that it felt like invisible shackles tying them to a situation they wanted desperately to leave but could not without risking everything they had built over years. What Baldoni's legal team did next stunned observers. They pulled court transcripts, depositions, and communication logs that allegedly revealed the moment where a witness stated they realized they were not free to act or speak without permission. One of the damning lines allegedly recorded was the chilling phrase, "You can leave, but you'll regret it," which according to Baldoni's camp was said by a close associate acting under Lively's instruction. Whether those words were metaphorical or not, the effect was undeniable. It froze people in place, and the new evidence sought to prove that the culture around Lively operated with the same chilling mechanics as a hostage environment. When the filings dropped, the courtroom gasped. Reports claimed that even the judge raised eyebrows as these descriptions rolled out. The narrative shifted instantly from a messy Hollywood feud to a moral battleground about coercion, control, and power abuse. Commentators pointed out that hostage situations are not always about physical walls. Sometimes they're built with fear, silence, and reputational leverage, and the testimonies began aligning too consistently to be ignored. One assistant's diary entries read like pleas for freedom, with lines such as, "I cannot breathe, I feel stuck, I cannot move without permission," and those words now presented as exhibits weighed heavily against the defense. Baldoni himself broke his silence for the first time in weeks in a carefully crafted but raw statement declaring that this was never about fame or headlines, it was about human dignity. He said, "When someone feels they are trapped against their will, even in the absence of physical restraint, we must ask ourselves what kind of culture we are protecting and what kind of power we are enabling." That statement resonated like a shockwave across platforms. Social media erupted. Hashtags began trending as creators, journalists, and fans debated whether Hollywood had once again protected one of its own at the expense of truth, while defenders tried to frame it as overblown exaggeration. The chilling alignment of accounts became hard to spin away. One clip that circulated rapidly featured a witness explaining that at the time they didn't call it hostage, but when they looked back, it was exactly that. They felt isolated, intimidated, and unable to speak freely or escape from the pressure surrounding. Then the host of a popular law commentary channel explained that this is what made the case explosive, because once the idea of coercion rises to the level of systemic abuse, courts have to take it seriously. Suddenly, what looked like a defamation brawl now resembled a case study in power imbalance and undue influence. Critics of Lively pointed out that if even half of what the documents showed was true, then this was a pivotal turning point not only for her career but for how Hollywood handled allegations of coercion at large. Meanwhile, the defense team scrambled to dismiss the hostage narrative as an absurd exaggeration, claiming it was a tactic to inflame emotions, but their rebuttals were drowned by the vividness of the testimonies. Each word, each phrase echoed like a haunting reminder that power unchecked could twist into something unrecognizable. One cultural commentator stated on a podcast that if the word hostage sticks in public consciousness, it may redefine how Hollywood's power games are scrutinized forever. The scandal transformed from whispers to a loud, deafening chorus, and the pressure was now squarely on Lively's camp to either dismantle the evidence or face a public reckoning like none she had ever encountered. And now we reach the stage where the tension inside and outside the courtroom is no longer something whispered in private conversations, but broadcast in real time across every platform, with millions tuning in desperate to catch the next misstep. And when Justin Baldoni's team revealed that the so-called hostage moment wasn't a metaphor but documented through evidence of legal entanglement, forced silence, and financial pressure, people gasped because the narrative shifted from celebrity drama to potential coercion, a theme Hollywood fears more than scandal because it implies systemic abuse of influence. The evidence highlighted carefully constructed contracts, clauses buried in fine print that locked collaborators into silence. And when those collaborators tried to break away, suddenly anonymous leaks appeared, tarnishing their credibility. It was not the kind of slip a careless assistant could make. It looked coordinated, planned, precise, and this is where the word hostage gained its sinister edge, because these individuals weren't chained in a basement, but bound by reputational traps, digital manipulation, and backroom deals that left them feeling trapped and powerless. The courtroom fell silent when Baldoni's Lawyer walked the jury through one leaked exchange showing pressure tactics. Allegedly tied back to Lively's camp, the message was blunt, reminding the collaborator of what they stood to lose if they spoke out. It didn't need a threat of violence. The weight of career destruction was threat enough, and suddenly the judge leaned forward, asking in open court how such tactics could be justified in any legal proceeding, and Lively's team had no clean answer, only vague gestures to industry norms, but those norms were exposed as exploitation masked in legal terms. The audience inside the courtroom shifted uneasily, and online viewers watching the updates live began drawing connections to their own workplaces, their own experiences of being silenced by those more powerful, and this universal sting gave Baldoni's revelations the power of a movement. People no longer saw this as a fight between two actors, but a mirror held up to an industry that weaponizes contracts and public image as shackles. What made it more explosive was the video clip Baldoni's side produced, a grainy but authenticated recording from a private meeting where a studio executive used the very word hostage, describing how certain creators can never escape their obligations because walking away would mean reputational death. The word echoed across the courtroom like a hammer strike, and in that moment the case shifted from celebrity spectacle to cultural reckoning. The public realized this wasn't about gossip, this was about how control operates in Hollywood, and how people are silenced through invisible chains. The coverage exploded on podcasts, on late-night discussions, on panels where lawyers debated whether Lively could survive this term, because even if she never personally drafted the contracts, her name attached to them made her complicit in the optics and optics drive the court of public opinion faster than any legal ruling. And so the shockwave continued. The public wanted answers, they wanted accountability, and Baldoni positioned himself not as the victim of one person, but as the whistleblower exposing a machinery that had for too long operated unchecked. This was the hostage moment, not in a literal sense, but in the terrifyingly modern way reputations, brands, and digital footprints are manipulated to trap those who dare resist. And the way the judge listened, intently jotting notes as if preparing to demand further discovery, suggested this wasn't going away anytime soon. The whispers in Hollywood turned to panic, because if Baldoni succeeded, it would mean decades of practice exposed and possibly dismantled. And now we reach the point where everything comes together: the lies, the contradictions, the shocking admissions, the hostile energy that surrounded Blake Lively, and the chilling reality of the word hostage. Because think about this, when someone says they felt held hostage, it is not just about being locked in a room, it is about being trapped in an environment where manipulation, coercion, and psychological control weigh heavier than physical walls. And this is the exact picture Justin Baldoni's team painted through the evidence they revealed, because when the emails were cross-referenced with sworn testimony, it became clear that meetings weren't voluntary, they were demanded. Conversations weren't discussions, they were commands. Agreements weren't mutual, they were dictated. And suddenly every supporter who had stood by Blake Lively with unwavering loyalty had to stop and wonder if they had unknowingly defended someone who may have been orchestrating a masterclass in control. Because in Hollywood, the word image is currency, and Blake had always been the untouchable brand, the golden girl, the one no one dared to question. But once the hostage narrative surfaced and evidence backed it up, the cracks in that brand widened faster than anyone could contain. And now we are left at a crossroads where the legal battle is not just about who said what, it is about credibility, it is about trust, it is about who has the courage to tell the truth when the consequences are career-shattering, and it is about whether audiences, the very lifeblood of celebrity, will forgive or condemn. Because we know how this industry works, stars are adored until they are not, and once the tide turns, there is no going back. But here's the haunting part: once evidence this strong enters the public record, it cannot be unseen, it cannot be erased, it cannot be rewritten. And for Blake Lively, this means the hostage claim will follow her every time she steps into court, every time she sits down for an interview, every time her name trends on social media. The question will be asked: is she guilty of holding others under the weight of her power? And for Ryan Reynolds, who has tried desperately to distance himself yet finds himself tied to every headline by association, the damage is already seeping through the carefully polished walls of his brand, because even silence now is seen as complicity. So where does this leave Justin Baldoni, stronger than before, with evidence that does not just poke holes in Blake's narrative but threatens to dismantle it entirely? And for Blake Lively, it leaves her in a place she has never been before, cornered, stripped of the invincible aura, forced to answer to claims that cut deeper than legal Jargon hostage is not just a word, it is an indictment of character, and that is something. Hollywood does not easily forgive, and now as this battle surges forward with new evidence surfacing by the week, we are left staring at a reality bigger than one lawsuit, bigger than one rivalry. This is about power unchecked, finally being dragged into the light, and no matter how this ends, one thing is certain: Blake Lively's world will never look the same again.